Chapter 5. What Infidelity Really Breaks. Infidelity is often spoken about as an event, a moment, a decision, a line crossed, and then the story of crossing it. We speak about it in singular terms, the affair, the betrayal, the discovery, as though it is something that happens once and then is over, with a clear beginning and a defined end, something that can be addressed and resolved and moved past. It is not. Infidelity is a fracture. And fractures do not stay contained. They travel through the immediate relationship, through the family structure built around it, through the individual identities of every person touched by it, through time. A fracture in a foundation does not announce which wall will eventually crack. It simply moves, finding the weaknesses that were always there and the ones that weren't, until the full extent of the damage becomes visible. And by then, the original break is often the least of it. This chapter is not a polemic about infidelity. It is not a moral verdict about the people in this story, or about any particular choice any of them made. It is an attempt to be honest about what infidelity actually does, what it breaks that does not announce itself loudly, what it costs that does not appear on any ledger, and why the cultural tendency to soften its impact with the language of narrative and explanation and moving forward is not a kindness to anyone, least of all to the people who have to live inside it. It breaks the story, first, before anything else, before the practical consequences, before the difficult conversations, before the decisions about what happens next. Infidelity breaks something that is harder to name and harder to repair than any of those things. It breaks the story people believe about their lives. Every person in a committed relationship carries a narrative. It is not always articulate or conscious, but it is present. A quiet, ongoing account of who we are to each other, and what the shape of our shared life means. It contains the specific, accumulated texture of years, the in-jokes and the rituals, the way arguments tend to end, the particular vocabulary that develops between two people who have spent enough time together to develop their own language. It contains the future, loosely held but present, the version of what comes next that has been assumed, if not always discussed. This narrative is one of the most fundamental structures of the self. We are, in large part, the stories we tell about our own lives. When infidelity is discovered, that story does not collapse loudly. It shifts, subtly at first, then completely. Because the discovery does not only change the present, it changes the past. The years that looked one way from the inside of the story must now be reevaluated from the outside of it. What was real? What was assumed that was not true? What was overlooked, not because it was not there, but because the narrative said it didn't need to be examined? What conversations have a different meaning now than they had when they were happening? What absences, what explanations, what small inconsistencies now need to be rearranged into a version that accounts for what was actually true? This process, the re-evaluation of a shared history in the light of a revelation, is one of the least discussed and most devastating aspects of betrayal. It is not a single moment of grief. It is an ongoing, exhausting excavation of a past you thought you knew, searching for the places where the story was different from what you were living inside of. And the question that accompanies that excavation, and that does not go away easily, is the one that cuts deepest. What else don't I know? Trust does not shatter. It dissolves. We say trust is broken because the metaphor of breaking feels accurate to the experience of the discovery, sudden, loud, irreversible. But the more honest metaphor for what happens to trust in the aftermath of infidelity is dissolution. It spreads, it seeps, it migrates out of the specific context of the betrayal and into everything that surrounds it. This is not irrational. It is the mind doing exactly what it has been designed to do, revising its threat assessment based on new information. If the person who was supposed to be the safest person was lying, then the assumption of safety itself needs to be revised. And once that revision begins, it does not stop neatly at the edges of the relationship. It extends into the small moments of daily life that were previously neutral. A delayed response to a message, a changed tone of voice, a new habit that wasn't there before. Things that once meant nothing now carry the weight of possibility. Not because they are necessarily significant, but because the architecture of trust that made them legible as insignificant has been dismantled. This is what researchers and clinicians have come to call betrayal trauma, a term first developed by psychologist Jennifer Freyd in 1991 to describe the specific, qualitatively different kind of wound that is produced when trust is violated by someone we depend on. Freyd's insight was that betrayal by an attachment figure, a partner, a parent, someone foundational to our sense of safety, creates a form of trauma that is distinct from trauma caused by external threats. The person who hurt you was the person who was supposed to protect you. That specific inversion of the expected structure of safety is what makes betrayal so cognitively and emotionally disorienting. Research bears this out in striking terms. Studies find that between 30 and 60% of betrayed partners experience symptoms that meet the clinical criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder: intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, nightmares, flashbacks, a persistent state of physiological activation that does not subside when the immediate crisis has passed. Some clinicians have coined the term post-infidelity stress disorder to describe this cluster of symptoms because PTSD's diagnostic criteria technically require a threat to physical safety. And yet, the symptom profile in betrayed partners is, study after study confirms, nearly identical. The suffering is real. The neurological and psychological response is real. The label is the only thing that is technically inadequate. Even when answers are given, even when the full account is eventually provided, when the questions are answered and the timeline is established and the explanation is offered, the trust does not simply reconstitute, because what trust requires is not information. It requires the felt sense of safety. And that felt sense, once destabilized, does not return on the basis of explanation alone. It returns, if it returns, slowly, through the accumulation of consistent experience over time. There is no shortcut. There is no narrative that makes it faster. Identity is altered. There is a dimension of infidelity's impact that receives even less attention than the damage to trust, and that is the damage to the self-concept of the person who was betrayed. This is not only about what they now think of their partner. It is about what they now think of themselves. Research published in Psychology Today and in clinical literature on betrayal trauma documents a consistent pattern. Betrayed partners frequently experience a significant erosion of self-esteem. They begin to ask questions about themselves that were not part of their identity before the betrayal. Was I not enough? Did I miss something that I should have seen? Was I living in a version of reality that was not true? And if so, what does that say about my judgment, my perception, my ability to know the people closest to me? Was the person I understood myself to be in this relationship, loved, trusted, known, actually the person I was? Or was that, too, a story I was telling myself while something else was happening? These questions are not always rational in the strict sense. but they are not irrational either. They are the mind's attempt to make sense of a fundamental inconsistency between what was believed and what was true. And the process of working through them, of arriving at a version of the self that is not defined by the betrayal, but that has honestly integrated it, is one of the most demanding psychological tasks a person can undertake. It does not happen in weeks. It does not happen in months. For many people, it takes years. There is also a subtler, longer-term risk that the research identifies. When the felt sense of self is damaged by betrayal, when the person begins to believe, at some level, that they were not enough, that they were foolish to trust, that love is inherently conditional and unreliable, that altered self-concept does not stay contained to the relationship in which the betrayal occurred. It travels forward. It shapes how they approach vulnerability in subsequent relationships. It influences what they believe they deserve and what they are willing to ask for. It can, in its most damaging form, lead to a redefinition of love that incorporates betrayal as an expected rather than aberrant element, the development of what some researchers call an altered definition of love, in which the very concept of loving someone becomes entangled with the anticipation of being hurt. This is the long shadow that infidelity casts. Not just the immediate damage to the relationship in which it occurred, but the revision of the self that must either be done consciously and carefully, with support, or that happens anyway, underground, shaping everything that follows. Children carry what they cannot name. The impact of infidelity on children is documented in research with a thoroughness that public conversation about infidelity rarely reflects. This is not because the research is obscure. It is because the impact on children is inconvenient to the narrative that infidelity, particularly in cases where the people involved are adults making considered choices about their own lives, is fundamentally a private matter between the parties directly involved. It is not. According to clinical psychologist Dr. Ana Nogales, whose extensive research and clinical practice informs the book Parents Who Cheat, parental infidelity causes most children to question everything they believed was real or true about their family. Her research found that 75% of children report lingering feelings of betrayal toward the cheating parent. 80% say the infidelity shapes their outlook on romance and relationships, and 70% describe it as having affected their own ability to trust. These are not marginal figures. They represent the overwhelming majority of children who go through this experience. Children do not need full explanations to feel disruption. They feel it in the tone of conversations that were not meant for them, in the tension that adults believe they are successfully concealing, and that children, who are specifically attuned to the emotional environment of the adults they depend on, read with remarkable accuracy. They notice the absence, the physical absence of a parent who is no longer at the dinner table, the emotional absence of a parent who is present but unreachable, absorbed by a grief or a crisis that has not been explained. They absorb what is not said. They adapt because adaptation is what children do, and adaptation in this context means adjusting to a family that has changed in ways they do not fully understand and were not consulted about. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Divorce and Remarriage found that children who experience parental infidelity are significantly more likely to suffer from feelings of abandonment and betrayal, not as an occasional response, but as a persistent feature of their emotional landscape. Research published in Family Relations in 2021 found that children of unfaithful parents are at a 25% higher risk of engaging in infidelity in their own adult relationships. The pattern repeats, not because infidelity is genetic, but because the models of relationship that children absorb in childhood become the templates through which they understand what relationships are and what they require. As child psychologist Dr. Joshua Coleman has observed, when children learn about a parent's affair, the world becomes a less safe place. The structures of protection and security are damaged, leaving children feeling exposed and vulnerable. This vulnerability does not resolve itself through the passage of time alone. Children who are not given the opportunity to process what happened in age-appropriate, honest, careful conversation with the adults who love them carry unresolved feelings that, as researchers Nagash and Morgan documented in 2016, can include self-blame, a diminished capacity for trust, and a heightened fear of abandonment that persists into adulthood. The children in this story have not been named in any public account. They live on both sides of the situation, in the household that was disrupted by a discovery and in the households that were disrupted by a public exposure. The research tells us something about what they are likely carrying, even if we do not know its specific contours. And what it tells us is that the cost to children is not a side note. It is one of the central costs of what happened. And the fact that it has been almost entirely absent from the public conversation about this story, absent from the interviews, absent from the commentary, absent even from most of the feminist analysis that has rightly examined the gendered asymmetry of the consequences, is itself a form of omission that deserves to be named. The particular cruelty of public discovery. This book has already examined in Chapter 4 the specific violence of Megan Kerrigan Byron's discovery, the way the Internet removed from her every choice about how to find out, who to tell, and how to begin the process of absorbing something that, in any other circumstance, would have happened privately. But it is worth examining, in this chapter's broader context, about what infidelity breaks, what public discovery does to the psychological damage that infidelity already produces. The research on betrayal trauma assumes, in most cases, private discovery, a discovered phone, an overheard conversation, a confession. These forms of discovery are already traumatic. They already produce the PTSD-level symptoms, the identity disruption, the dissolution of trust that the research documents. But they happen in private. They allow, however inadequately, for the first moments of response to be personal rather than performative, for the shock to be lived rather than witnessed. Public discovery removes that entirely. It adds to the psychological burden of betrayal a layer of shame, exposure, and involuntary visibility that the private form of the same discovery does not carry. The betrayed person must now manage their own internal crisis while simultaneously managing how they are perceived by an audience they did not invite. The grief cannot be processed before the performance of response is required. The questions cannot be asked privately before the world forms its opinions about what the answers should be. This is not a small addition to the burden of betrayal. It is a qualitative escalation of it. And it was the form of discovery that was made available to Megan Kerrigan Byron through no choice of her own on the evening of July 16, 2025. While Kristen Cabot processed her mortification in the stadium and in the days that followed, and while Andy Byron processed nothing publicly at all, the person whose discovery was most fundamentally altered by the public nature of the exposure has never been offered any form of public acknowledgement of that specific harm. Even when it ends well. There is a narrative about separation and the aftermath of infidelity that exists as a kind of cultural consolation, the idea that things can be handled maturely and amicably. That intention can soften impact, that people who approach the end of a relationship with care and good faith can emerge from it with their dignity and their relationships with their children substantially intact. Sometimes this is true. Sometimes people do separate with genuine care, with a shared commitment to minimizing harm, with enough mutual respect and emotional maturity to manage the process in a way that, while painful, does not produce lasting damage. This is real, and it is worth acknowledging. But even in the best versions of this, even in the most carefully managed, most intentionally respectful separations, something has changed that does not simply return to its previous state. The ending is not neutral. It is shaped by everything that came before it. And the before, when it includes infidelity, is not a neutral before. It is a before that includes the specific kind of fracture this chapter has been examining, the fracture in the shared story, in the architecture of trust, in the self-concept of the person who was not told the truth. The reports of Andy and Megan Byron being seen together in Maine in September and October 2025, apparently not having filed for divorce, apparently navigating something together, are not necessarily evidence of resolution. They may be evidence of the complicated, nonlinear, profoundly human reality of two people who have built a life together and who are working out, in private, what that life now means and what it will become. That process is neither simple nor predictable, and it does not follow the clean narrative arc of either staying or leaving that the culture tends to prefer. What the research on infidelity recovery tells us is that healing, when it occurs, is not about returning to what things were. It is about building something new, something that must account honestly for what happened, that cannot be built on a foundation of incomplete truth, and that requires, above everything else, that the person who was betrayed is given what they actually need to make an informed choice about their own life. Not the managed version, the whole of it. There is no clean break. Relationships are not modules that can be extracted cleanly from the structures that surround them. They are woven into families, into the identities of children, into the extended networks of friends and families who have organized their own lives around the assumption of the relationship's stability. When something fractures within a relationship, it does not fracture only there. It moves. It finds the connections, the dependencies, the places where the relationship was load-bearing for structures that had nothing directly to do with the two people at its center. This is what "there is no clean break" means. Not that separation is impossible or that damaged relationships cannot be ended with as much care as the circumstances allow, but that the assumption of clean ending, the idea that if you handle it correctly, the impact can be contained to the people most directly involved, is almost always wrong. The impact distributes itself according to the actual architecture of the life that was built, not according to the preferences of the people who are managing the ending. For the Byron family, the architecture included 2 sons, a home, a school community in Worcester where Megan is known professionally, an extended network of family and friends who visited her in Maine when the crisis was at its worst. None of those things are separable from what happened. All of them carry some portion of the weight, and all of them will carry that weight for a period that is not determined by the news cycle, or by the conclusion of a corporate investigation, or by the resignation of a CEO, or by the number of interviews given. It is determined by the specific, individual, unmeasurable pace at which human beings integrate difficult things into their understanding of their own lives. That pace is slow. It is not linear. It does not follow the narrative arc of the story that was told publicly, and it is happening right now in a way that has no platform and requires none. Believe me, I know. There are things you understand intellectually from the outside, things you can research, document, analyze, and present with the appropriate references and the appropriate care, And then there are things you understand because you have lived them, because they have moved through you and changed the shape of something you did not know could be changed, because you know, from the inside, what the research is actually describing when it talks about the dissolution of trust and the revision of the self and the slow, non-linear process of integrating something that does not integrate cleanly. I am writing this chapter from both places. I know what it is to re-examine a shared history and find that the story you were living inside was not the whole story. I know the specific quality of that re-examination, the way it reaches backward as well as forward, the way it changes not only what you think of the other person, but what you think of yourself. The questions that do not have satisfying answers. The absence of a clean account that would allow you to say, now I understand, and now I can move forward with a clear picture of what happened. I know what it is to watch someone tell the story of what happened in a way that is emotionally compelling and structurally coherent, and that is, nonetheless, not the story that was lived by everyone in it. I know the specific discomfort of recognizing that gap between the told story and the lived one, and of not being in a position to close it, of having to carry the knowledge of the gap while the told story circulates, is believed, is sympathized with, and becomes the version that history will record. I am not writing this to center my own experience. This book is not about me. But I want to be honest about why this chapter, this particular examination of what infidelity actually breaks, is not written from a distance. It is written from recognition. And recognition is, as Chapter 1 of this book argued, one of the most powerful forces in how we understand stories that are not our own. It is what makes those stories matter. It is what transforms the account of two people on a jumbotron from entertainment into the thing it actually was, a moment that resonated because the people watching it recognized something they had lived or feared living or knew someone who had lived it. This chapter is for those people, for the recognition they brought to that 15 seconds, for the understanding they have in their bodies and not only in their minds of what infidelity actually breaks, and how long it takes to begin to build something in the place of what was broken. Why this matters beyond this story. Every element of the Coldplay concert story has been examined in public discussion, primarily through the lens of the specific people involved, the CEO, the head of HR, the viral moment, the corporate scandal, the interviews. These are the terms in which the story has been narrated, and they are not wrong. Those things are part of the story, but beneath them, structurally, is something much larger than one company, one concert, one jumbotron. Infidelity is not an aberration. Research suggests approximately 1 in 4 couples experiences it. It is one of the most cited reasons for divorce. It produces, in its wake, one of the most well-documented patterns of psychological harm in the clinical literature. And yet, public conversation about it, particularly when it intersects with the language of narrative and platform and speaking one's truth, consistently gravitates toward the experience of the person who made the choices and away from the experience of the people who did not. This is the pattern this book is examining, not in the abstract, in the specific. In the case of a woman who has been on 2 major media platforms in 8 months, and whose ability to shape the narrative of what happened has produced a version of events in which her suffering is central and the suffering of the people most directly affected by the choices that preceded the concert is structural, peripheral, and unnamed. When we begin to treat infidelity as something that can be explained away, softened by the language of separation and mutual development and plans for disclosure, we risk something, not just in this story, in all of them. we risk losing the honest accounting of what infidelity actually does to the people in its path, the fracture, the dissolution, the altered identity, the children who carry what they cannot name, the partners who must rebuild a sense of self from a foundation that was broken before they knew it needed repair. These are the things the research documents. These are the things that do not make it into the interviews. And these are the things that this book refuses to set aside, because the truth of what infidelity breaks is not served by the narrative that places the greatest weight of its consequences on the person who was caught. The weight and the truth belong somewhere else.